And I would submit then esotericism actually drives scientific advancement, like the antithesis of what most people believe. Like it's like, mysticism's the adversary of science. Like the esoteric tradition actually drives it.
All right, so this is Karl Nell. What he says here is, I think, very interesting to what we just looked at. It's what in the idea that disclosure, whether you like it or not, because I know there is a lot of brain dead Bradleys out there who they're very interested in UFOs, but when you start talking about ESP, when you start talking about consciousness and psychics, the ape brain comes out. The ape brain starts, me no like UFO. It's fucking crazy. Like, it's wild to me how people in this space are like, oh yeah, we can talk about UFOs. We can talk about these ships that apparently fly with a propulsion system that we don't know, and that these aliens might be coming from a complete other planet with technology we can't even understand. Oh, but extrasensory perception? You're a whack job. You're a conspiracy theorist. I don't want to hear about the woo. Like, bro, who drew that line for you? Because, like, for me, when you realize, like, UFOs are real, and you realize you've been lied to about it for your entire life, I mean, the door is now wide open to me. Like, what the fuck else haven't you been telling me? What else is true that you've been lying to me about? Because I don't think it just stops at UFOs, and this is what Karl Nell is going to talk to us about.
The problem becomes unlearning. And so I would suggest that there's actually like this fifth threshold of evidence, which is what I call the threshold of unlearning, or if you want the unreasonable person standard.
But already he's saying quotes that I think are that we need to remember. The problem is unlearning. It's unlearning. Because people, whether they've been alive for 20, 40, 50, 60 years, it's loud. Okay, I'll put it down a bit, sorry. I feel like the older you get, the worse it is, right? If you've been alive for 60 years thinking that drinking beers and watching football is the pinnacle of why we were born here, and now suddenly someone is trying to tell you, no, actually ESP is real and we're being manipulated by an interdimensional intelligence, that's going to be very difficult. Like, I understand that. I completely understand that. So, and like that information won't lay on top of your worldview. It doesn't fit together. So before we can put that layer on there, we actually have to rip up the floorboards. We have to rip up the bullshit, the crap, the paradigm that your mind was shoved into ever since you entered school. And that's difficult. That's difficult. And this is what he's talking about. Yo, if you're enjoying this clip, make sure you subscribe below and head on over to the main channel if you want to watch the full replay of this video. You might even be able to catch one of the streams live one time and get involved in the chat as well. All the links you need will be down below.
Which is what the problem is, which is somebody's got to unlearn what they already know to be able to entertain this topic. But maybe that's actually like an achievable standard in the sense that these podcasts and these discussions and social media and the context in society that's driving the discussion will get people to at least reevaluate what they already think they know. So you're not going to give them proof, but maybe you can help them unlearn things that maybe there isn't enough data to actually weigh in on and get to more of a Epicurus kind of state. So I think this context is important for like this disclosure discussion because again, we're trying to get the government to release some information, right? So in order to get the government to do anything, you've got to kind of mobilize support to the government in the public policy arena. And then, what does disclosure actually look like in terms of people integrating that into their worldview? And how does that relate to this?
Aaron Peterson says, duh, beer, football, pizza, duh. Yeah, it is like that, unfortunately. But, actually, and Karl actually kind of touches on this a little bit, that it's like that in the West. I mean, it's like that in other places too, but it's very like that in the West. And when you realize that this is a conscious decision at somewhere far up the chain, that's when you start to realize, oh, so you all worship Baal. No, not exactly, but kind of something like that, probably. But what's also interesting about Karl Nell is that he held senior positions at Northrop Grumman. Very senior positions at Northrop Grumman, and comes from an intelligence background. So, I always really liked listening to Karl Nell. He seems like a very grounded, down-to-earth person with good intentions. And I thought it was a real shame when he, stepped away from disclosure, especially after putting in work like this, like big presentations, slideshows, detailing roadmaps on how we can actually get this information out to the public in a safe way that isn't going to make the ape brain Bradley's mind short circuit when they realize that football isn't actually the pinnacle of society. Breaking news.
Surprise, surprise, non-disclosure of uncomfortable aspects of reality is a universal across all culture and time. Like UAP is an instance, right? Like it's just a modern, like, blip. Like this is like the way it works. Like go back to ancient Egypt, you had the inner temple and the outer temple, right? Like the people didn't even get into the temple. But if you were, fortunate enough to be in the, like a priest or, a supplicant, and you could get into the temple, which is where you're going to get like instruction, right? Their version of like a college. It's stratified. Like you don't get into the inner temple unless you meet, certain criteria, right? So they're keeping some stuff from the uninitiated. It's sort of the structure of things, right?
Isn't that interesting? All the way back in ancient Egypt, like almost the same structures are in place that, the regular people they're not allowed into the temple. That's only for the initiated. So you have hidden knowledge, you have occult knowledge like this. And, knowledge is power. You have certain sections of society that are initiated into certain parts of knowledge that relate to the true nature of reality, which means that certain groups aren't allowed to know the truth about the world that they live in. And that this isn't new. This dates back to, again, ancient Egypt with the temples, but it also, like Karl Nell said, relates to UAP, and that a UAP is just an instance of this.
This occurs because aspects of reality threaten sort of the organization of society or the power structure of society. So when we think about, Condon Committee evaluating the work of Blue Book and Ed Condon basically writing the conclusions of the study before the study was done and bragging about that publicly. This is back in 1968, 1969. And then having defection of all the scholars at the University of Colorado that were working on the study, and then seeing the study published and the data and cases in the study don't match the conclusions, but the study still was used to close Project Blue Book and end the government's investigation into this topic. There's like plenty of evidence that there is like the desire to obfuscate certain topics, right? So I think that's pretty much fundamental, and we've got to put this problem in the context of that being fundamental across all human societies and all civilizations across all time.
And isn't that wild? Like he's basically saying that this idea that sections of society have not been included into certain parts of knowledge that explain the true nature of reality. This dates back to ancient Egypt with the temples and whatnot, and I'm sure potentially even earlier. So what we're talking about here in terms of disclosure and allowing the masses to understand the true nature of reality, this isn't like some 21st century little hiccup that we've got into. It's like trying to restructure the way things have been for basically ever.
So then there's this idea of NHI exists in the reality of hierarchy of being. So I talked about why NHI exists, but this hierarchy is actually fundamental to every religious tradition, right? There's not a single religious tradition that doesn't say that there's a higher power, right? And this even traces back to shamanism, which is the most earliest form of religious or metaphysical engagement, and it occurs in every culture from the very beginning. Cave art from the Paleolithic, 15,000, 30,000 years ago, is clearly considered to have religious connotation. So all people, all cultures, all times have already believed in this hierarchy of being. And today we talk about creating, artificial general intelligence. So, is that going to be smarter than us, better than us, worse than us? Where does that fall? You've got this hierarchy. You've got, the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom. And then if you've got another civilization, which I'm suggesting is the case, is that going to be exactly co-equal to us? What if it's been around 100,000 years longer than we have? What if it's been around 1 million years longer than we have? What if it's been around 2 billion years longer than we have, which there's time for?
Sorry, can we just put a little highlighter over the fact that Karl Nell just said, what if there's another civilization, which I'm suggesting there is. This is the guy who works in army intelligence with the NRO and high places in Northrop Grumman is saying, what if there is another civilization, and I am suggesting that there is. What else do you want?
So, how does that fit in? Are they more capable in some way? So there's a certain reticence to want to accept this in the first world rationalist, modern civilizations, because essentially we've put our civilization and humankind at the top of the pyramid. Yeah, there's a hierarchy, sure, but we're at the top. Sort of secular rationalism.
Wrong.
So it's very injurious to a complete understanding of probably how reality works, right? So the second, third world developing nations don't have this problem. Indigenous cultures don't have this problem. The medieval era didn't have this problem. But only like the secular West really has this problem. And I would submit it's a huge impediment, and it's part of the context for why this problem remains.
Why is that? Why does the secular West seem to be the only ones that have this problem? Why is that? Kind of weird. Surely we're not the bad guys. Surely we wouldn't enslave our own people and trick them into thinking they're free and telling them that chasing a corporate career job and getting a mortgage and being in debt for your whole life is the best thing you could do. Surely we wouldn't do that, because that sounds kind of evil. We're not evil, right?
People can't engage with this because it threatens their worldview. So then this is totally central to Diana's work. Cosmism was a motivating factor in both the US and USSR space programs. And so why is that relevant? Well, you could argue really that those programs drove like the scientific enterprise that has created the world that we're living in. So the basis tech, we all say space program tech, space age tech, that was a long, long time ago. But really, we still kind of view our society as being, accelerated out of that. So the Jack Parsons of the world, Tchaikovskys and Soviet Union, they really were driven by like an esoteric view. And I would submit then, therefore, that esotericism actually drives scientific advancement. It's like the antithesis of what most people believe.
That's crazy what Karl Nell just said, the guy from the NRO, the guy in military intelligence, the guy in high places in Northrop Grumman just said esotericism drives scientific innovation. He also referenced Jack Parsons and Tchaikovsky as well. So that's the father of America's rocket program, the father of Russia's rocket program. Both were doing their own versions of rituals and thinking that they were speaking with either angels or like a non-human intelligence, and they credit that non-human intelligence for their advancement in rocketry. This is like the early 20th century. Germany as well. Okay, I've talked about that on the channel before. Hermann Oberth, father of Germany's rocket program, before Werner von Braun, said, "We cannot take the full credit for our advancements because we have been helped, and we have been helped by the people of other worlds." That is a quote from the German's father of rocketry. And you've got America and Russia also doing their own version of rituals. Jack Parsons out in the desert with Aleister Crowley, doing some weird shit. Probably a bit too graphic to say. Sex magic. We'll say sex magic. They also attribute their advancements and knowledge to a non-human intelligence that they were in contact with. And I'll continue playing it in a second. Tim Taylor, the elusive figure that Diana Pasulka writes about, he himself says that, this is the NASA Dragon launch operator who apparently has dog tags for CIA, NRO, everything, says that he himself has his own protocols, which is more like lifestyle, like diet, meditation, yoga, that he is also able to connect with a non-human intelligence and receive downloads, and the information that he has received through these downloads is then put into practice, and he is making companies that are extremely successful, or inventions, patented technology based on the things he's receiving from a non-human intelligence.
And I would submit then, therefore, that esotericism actually drives scientific advancement. It's like the antithesis of what most people believe. Like it's like, mysticism's the adversary of science. Like the esoteric tradition actually drives it.
Isn't that just wild to hear? People need to understand this. People really need to understand this and get it through your head quickly so we can get on with things. Please do us a favor.
So I think it's very important to maybe understand that. And then this idea of consciousness playing a role in both physics and metaphysics. And what I mean by that, I would submit that it's sort of the work by Hameroff and Penrose on the orchestrated objective reduction idea of how consciousness really works is moving us toward an actual physics-based theory of consciousness. I'm a big, opponent, if you will, of the strong form of the Church-Turing thesis, right? So, everybody knows Alan Turing, famous British computer scientist, came up with the formalism for the Turing machine, which is the basis for the theoretical foundation for computability. Alonzo Church was his graduate advisor. He was actually an American logistician. And so everybody was trying to figure out this concept of computability. And you had Kurt Gödel weighing in. You had like the System S kind of framework. You had Cantor with lambda calculus. You had Turing. Ultimately, Church threw in with his graduate students, said, okay, I'll accept that the Turing machine formalism is equivalent to the set of computable functions. This is almost like it's a tautology, it's a definition. It's called the Church-Turing thesis. And so people wanted to expand on that thesis, and so they came up with a strong form. They wanted to expand it to random and human theoretic kind of computation. And in the logic, there's a lot of ways to kind of frame this, and a lot of people are familiar with this, but I'll run through it quickly. The idea was that if I can express myself in a natural language, like we're doing right now, English. And English can be related to a mathematical formal system, with rules of grammar. So, if I'm, breaking the rules of grammar, you tell me, right? We've got a consensus reality on that. Then, in some sense, I could program that into a computer because it's a formal system, and that creates some sort of equivalence between anything I can think of and what I could program in the computer. So that's essentially the strong form of the Church-Turing thesis, which is the intellectual foundation for general purpose AI. And you're like, okay, why would you disagree with that? It makes sense, right? But I would submit, in common conversation, in literature, in poetry, we're always breaking the rules of grammar. The idioms, contractions, colloquialism, slang, incorrect grammar and poetry. We're breaking out of the formal system because we can't communicate what we want to communicate. We're changing the rules. We're breaking the box. We're basically constrained by Gödel incompleteness, but we're basically going around that by reframing the formal system.
The framework that our knowledge set is built upon doesn't include the ideas and themes that come with disclosure. So again, it kind of goes back to the deprogramming thing. You can't just give disclosure because it's going to break the framework that most people who admittedly live under a rock have been brought up with, right? So, we need to kind of create a new language. We need to reshape the language first before we can actually communicate what we're saying. Otherwise, it's just not going to work and it's not going to land. And as I said, if you go back to ancient Egypt, only certain people were allowed into the temples. This whole idea of occult knowledge, which pertains to the true nature of reality, goes back a long way. So far back that to reveal it to the uninitiated would be like a ontological nuclear bomb. It would fry some people's brains, I think. And I guess I should be clear on I actually brought this clip in for a reason, and that is because of this. Because of the whole Steven Spielberg thing, and that his movie was being filmed at a religious church or whatever, okay? So there is going to be themes of the supernatural, of spirituality, of interdimensional intelligences and forces potentially manipulating or working with us. And I think people need to get used to that, and they need to start ripping up their floor and preparing their mind and to having to relearn a new framework to look at reality with, because the one you currently have, the one where you think football is the pinnacle of society and drinking beers is the coolest thing you can do every weekend, that ain't gonna work anymore, bro. That ain't gonna work. And if you want to stick with that, well, in like 2,000 years, you'll be in a zoo, and people who have built a new framework will be in looking at you, watching you watch football and drink beer and stuff, and be like, damn, look at those monkeys. They're fucking cooked.